BBC Radio Wales.
Very good evening to you. Newsnight now on BBC Two Wales.
Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belong to his neighbors?
First action, then reaction. The West begins piling sanctions on Putin's Russia. As the Russians move forward, Western countries start shaping their response to raise the economic pain. Latvia's Prime Minister tells us whatever happens now, European security will never be quite the same. Also tonight, the world awaits Vladimir Putin's next move, but does so knowing the dark view of history that now seems to guide him. We'll digest another momentous day with experts from across the worlds of politics and diplomacy. Good evening. It's been a day in which both Russia and the West have stepped up their confrontation. At the moment, there's no sense of how this might end or even be contained. Indeed, tonight the US announced it's moving additional troops and Apache helicopters to the Baltic republics. President Putin, meanwhile, said today that Ukraine and the West, what they would need to do to end this, but they were requests with no chance of being met. Tonight, we devote the whole programme to this worsening crisis and what it might mean. Now, it's been a day of fast-moving events on many fronts. So let's look at the main developments. NATO says Russian army troops have entered the separatist enclaves in Luhansk and Donetsk following their recognition by Russia yesterday. We don't know the exact units deployed so far, but it isn't more than a handful of the 125 or so battalion tactical groups deployed around Ukraine's borders. So, substantial forces remain uncommitted, including the Russian troops in Belarus, anything up to 50,000 of them, and to the south in Crimea. This afternoon, the Kremlin started stepping through the process of authorising the use of Russian troops abroad. What we don't know yet is whether that means large-scale advances into Ukraine or, for example, hitting targets throughout that country with missiles. Mr. Putin has also opened the prospect of trying to drive back the Ukrainians from all of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Currently, the Kremlin-backed rebels only hold part of them. On the western side, sanctions were announced. Perhaps the biggest headline grabber was Germany's, that it would not grant a licence for the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline to operate. That pipeline, which runs from Russia under the Baltic Sea to Germany, is in place, so arguably permission could still be granted for the pumps to start at some point in the future. But Germany also says it's looking for alternatives to Russian gas. Other restrictions have been announced by the EU against 3 Russian banks. The UK is also trying to cut off 2 of those from foreign credit. The UK has also announced an asset freeze on 3 oligarch friends of Mr. Putin. This evening, across the Atlantic, President Biden added to the sanctions and the condemnation of the Russian leader.
You don't need blood unless you plan on starting a war. Over the last few days, we've seen much of the playbook that Secretary Blinken laid out last week in the United Nations Security Council come to pass. None of us should be fooled. None of us will be fooled. There is no justification. Further Russian assault in Ukraine remains a severe threat in the days ahead. And if Russia proceeds, it is Russia and Russia alone that bears the responsibility.
Now, our international editor, Gabriel Gatehouse, has been looking at today's developments and the conflicting narratives.
The Kremlin says it's deploying peacekeepers. To the rest of the world, they are occupying forces heading into land that is legally part of Ukraine. There is confusion around what territory exactly Russia has recognized. Is it that part of eastern Ukraine that is de facto already controlled by the separatists? Or is it the whole of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions? Vladimir Putin today implied the latter, raising the imminent possibility of Russian forces going into battle over territory currently held by Ukraine. In the rebel-held city of Donetsk, some were celebrating. But while some welcomed Moscow's recognition of their breakaway republic, the evacuation continued. Thousands are still leaving, heading across the Russian border, where they hope they'll be safe.
Я не знаю, насколько это действительно хорошее решение и насколько оно может привести к миру. Сейчас все очень переживают, у всех забирают отцов, братьев, мужей. На самом деле очень страшно.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the contact line, people in Ukrainian-controlled territory wait nervously. Near the front line, a residential building was hit by a shell. This has been going on for 8 years now, but it could be about to get a whole lot worse. Further afield, in the eastern city of Kharkiv, right on the border with Russia, there's a sense of unreality about the threat. School kids holding drills in case of an invasion. The mayor of Kharkiv told me Ukraine was facing its greatest danger in 8 years of conflict, but he said his city was prepared for any eventuality.
У нас есть карта укрытий, у нас есть бомбоубежище, так называемое, у нас система метрополитена, которая работает в экстремальных ситуациях, как тоже укрытие для людей. Это аптечки, это необходимый резерв воды, топлива, медикаментов и так далее.
All across Ukraine, they're holding their breath, waiting to see what Putin decides to do. And not just in Ukraine. This is, without doubt, one of the biggest moments in Vladimir Putin's 22-year rule. Perhaps even more so than 2008, the war in Georgia, or even 2014, the annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in Donbass. What the Russian president did yesterday was to put his country on a direct and explicit collision course with the West.
Will sanctions be enough to stop Putin, Prime Minister?
The UK, as well as the US and the EU, have announced some immediate sanctions with the prospect of more to come. The question is, what will deter Moscow?
Ultimately, these people like Putin and Assad in Syria and all the rest of them will keep going until there is a line drawn that they cannot cross, and that's what we need to be prepared for.
Should the West be drawing a line now? And where is that line?
So I think the sanctions regime is clearly the best way to go for now, but what I'm saying is that we need to be prepared that if we are required to take military action as part of a NATO task force, then we need to be prepared for that.
The world gained an insight yesterday into how Vladimir Putin sees his place in history.
Украина для нас это не просто соседняя страна. Это неотъемлемая часть нашей собственной истории, культуры, духовного пространства.
In a rambling historical speech, he claimed Ukraine was never really a proper nation.
Итак, начну с того, что современная Украина целиком и полностью была создана Россией. Точнее, большевистской, коммунистической Россией. Этот процесс начался практически сразу после революции 1917 года.
The end of the Soviet Union, he implied, should also mean the end of Ukraine. Putin seems to believe it is his historical mission to restore Russia's pre-revolutionary empire. But we learned something else about Russia's leader yesterday, something perhaps more important than his historical fantasies. Look at this exchange between Vladimir Putin and his foreign intelligence chief. Putin is asking him what the spy chief thinks he should do in Donbass. You don't need to speak Russian to understand the fear in his eyes. He doesn't know what Putin is thinking. None of them do. This was a demonstration of power, but also, perhaps, of weakness.
Firstly, he was trying to make sure that every one of his cabinet, of his war cabinet, I suppose now, was spattered with blood themselves. That's a technique that you do if you doubt the loyalty of those around you a little bit. It was actually an incredibly insecure act. And we must remember that in Russia, change always happens one way, the palace coup. That's what Putin really fears.
In Kiev today, there were protests. People are angry, but also fearful. Until today, few could contemplate a full-scale Russian invasion, Russian tanks moving on the Ukrainian capital. But now, suddenly, anything seems possible.
Gabriel Gatehouse there. In a moment, we'll be hearing from the Prime Minister of Latvia. But first, to discuss the West's options, or lack of them, we're joined in the studio by Lord Darragh, former National Security Advisor in the UK, and Rose Gottmiller, an American diplomat, joins us online. She was Deputy Secretary General of NATO. And from Kiev, Valery Chali, the former Ukrainian ambassador to the US. Welcome to you all. Lord Darragh, Kim Darragh, let's start with this question about escalation. There doesn't yet seem to be a way out of this, does there?
Mark, I think it looks pretty bleak. I suppose it is just about conceivable that having put his troops into eastern Ukraine, the separatist-controlled areas of eastern Ukraine, there might be a pause while Putin sees if there is any new opening for diplomacy, any new offering from the West, or whether the Ukrainians, under all this pressure, increased pressure, crumble and decide to say something about giving up their aspirations to join NATO. But I don't see much chance of either of those things happening.
Well, and for the pause to turn into peace, Vladimir Putin said today Ukraine would have to be demilitarised. They'd have to talk to the separatist leaders, something they've said they would never do. I mean, it just seems almost designed to fail.
I agree. He's loading on conditions to that, which are making it ever more difficult, ever more unlikely that any kind of negotiations can begin, let alone deal be struck.
Rose Gottmiller, let's bring you in. I mean, you devoted quite a part of your career to, if you like, trying to ease the tensions and the misunderstandings between NATO and Russia. Does it feel like your life's work has been reduced to ashes by these developments?
It is a pretty discouraging time, but I can't speak of my personal discouragement when so much is at stake here. I do think that we've had a great deal of success in the years since the breakup of the Soviet Union, actually working closely with Russia. And I like to remind that up until the incursion into Crimea in 2014, NATO had very active and pragmatic projects going forward with Russia on things like a civil airspace initiative to ensure safe operation of the skies in Europe. So in some ways, there was a kind of pragmatic agenda from NATO's perspective, not realizing that around the corner there was this geostrategic bomb about to drop of Putin creating NATO as the enemy. And that is what has happened in the years since 2014.
Valery Chali, I mean, when you hear those demands that were being made of Ukraine in order to stop further advances into your country, would you agree with Lord Darragh that it is designed to fail? And at what point do you think you might get to a sort of reasonable understanding of what the terms for dialogue might be with Russia?
Good evening. First of all, I agree completely. This is absolutely impossible, and it's not something new for us. I met with Putin plenty of times on different positions in different capacities, and we know very clear that Russian leaders should just recognize the right of Ukrainian people for existence. And this is really a problem, because in the circumstances you have two tracks, diplomacy and war. You can't do the two things at the same time. So it's Russia now who's made such impossibility of any diplomatic formats, and Secretary Blinken mentioned about it. So it's a pity, but now he rejects meeting with Sergei Lavrov. So that's a real problem that's created by Russians, not by Ukraine.
I'm just fascinated to hear you talking about your meetings with Vladimir Putin over the years. Do you think he always deep down wanted some kind of showdown or conflict with Ukraine, or do you think this is a recent development in his political psyche?
I remember in 2009, I welcomed him as a Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs in Crimea. It was a meeting of prime ministers in that time. And I said to him, welcome to Ukraine in Crimea. He was surprised. Yeah, I also was surprised, Frank. And from that period, there's not significant changes in his perception of Crimea, but significant changes of tools, including military means, that Russia want to use against, they mentioned many times, friendly people. Sometimes they mention Ukrainians and Russians, no any differences between us. Only one difference: you kill us, we defend our country, and that's the main problem. Putin, he's really in the position that's he think that's a restoring of Soviet Union in a time.
Right.
And he has additional money from oil supply and other things, and he decided it's a time just to reconsider the existing security order in Europe after World War.
Valery, sorry, just to jump in then, let's move on to what might be done then, realistically, by Western countries, by Ukraine now, to try and manage this in some sort of way. Clearly, enormous emphasis is being put on sanctions. The prospect of sanctions didn't deter him thus far, though, did it?
It didn't, Mark. But I think that, with the notable exception of what Chancellor Scholz has said about Nord Stream 2, it's clear that Americans, that us, that most, the European Union, are holding back on sanctions. That what has been done so far is comparatively modest, still painful for the Russians, but comparatively modest, because we
not
all
enough
know,
in your view. Sorry to jump in.
I think it was reasonable. And I think if I had been preparing advice for Number 10 for the Prime Minister on this, I would have probably ended up somewhere around there, because you need to hold some serious stuff back in case, as is now looking really quite possible, maybe even probable, that Putin's forces are sent to try and recapture the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk, which means breaching the separation line and taking on the Ukrainian forces on the other side of that line, which means real fighting. It means bullets and missiles and shells and, dare I say it, casualties. If they're going to do that, or if they're going to try and do the land bridge to Crimea, which we wondered when I was back National Security Advisor in 2014, we thought they might do it then. If they're going to do that, then we need something more to signal the West's opposition to what that's done.
Economic. But Rose Gottmiller, do you think Vladimir Putin has already priced that in to an extent, if he is still sending his forces forward? And doesn't he have quite a lot of escalatory options of his own?
Well, certainly he does. And by the way, the price of oil has gone sky high in the last day, up to $100 a barrel for Brent crude, and that benefits the Russian economy. It benefits Putin. He keeps a sharp eye on that market, certainly. So he may feel a bit of comfort from that. But I thought it was rather clever, actually, the way this current round of sanctions, they are sending some important signals to actors in the Russian society. For example, these new sanctions directed at oligarchs, they are also taking in their families. In the past, the oligarchs were able to pass their assets along to their children, and therefore, essentially, it was a loophole that prevented the 2014 sanctions and the later ones from really biting the oligarchs. But now they can't shelter in their children anymore, and so I think that is an important signal to them that things are getting tough. Likewise, VEB Bank, that's a pet bank of Putin's. It has funded such projects of his, such as the Sochi Olympics. So it's important that there are some hidden signals here.
I'm sorry, we've got precious little time left, but Kim Darroch, President Biden hinted at folks paying a price. I guess he's thinking about at the gas pumps, as Rose was saying, but perhaps in other terms to do with economic pressures that could be put on. Do you think the public is ready for that?
I think that the very different thing this time, Mark, from 2014, is the way that, led by Washington, the West has been calling out America publicly, using actually quite a lot of sensitive intelligence material every stage of this. And I don't know whether the public is ready, but they're certainly a lot more ready than they might have been if that hadn't happened. So governments in the West have done their best to alert the public to what is coming up. But of course, when prices go up or stay up at petrol pumps or gas prices, your gas bills, that's going to be painful, and people will wish it hadn't happened.
Absolutely. Kim Darroch, Rose Gottmiller, Valery Chali, thank you both all indeed for appearing on Newsnight. Inevitably, it's those countries closest to Russia that feel most concerned. Earlier, we spoke to the Latvian Prime Minister and began by asking him whether Latvia felt less secure now than it did yesterday.
The Western world is really rallying together. And what everyone is saying is a very clear no to Vladimir Putin's imperialistic hopes of recreating an empire. But with the raft of sanctions that are coming out from the UK, it looks like from the US, Canada, the European Union, these are all coordinated. These are actually very big decisions that maybe 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago, many would have thought, I don't know if the NATO and the European Union, whether the countries will stick together. We are sticking together. This is a big deal because it's the first step to stopping Putin and his imperialistic hopes.
Do you have any concern or fear that as the sanctions build up, President Putin will say, you are trying to destroy our country. It is therefore our right to respond.
It's very tough when most of us want to live in peace and keep things the way that they are. And there's one, it's like a bully coming into the classroom that wants to change the entire order and is willing to hit people. In this case, Putin is willing to use his military. So we have two choices. We can try to back down, try to appease, but we know from history that appeasement unfortunately leads nowhere. So we have to stand up to that.
I just wonder, one of the reasons why I asked the question is, I mean, one hopes that there are off-ramps here and that at some point the situation calms, the escalation ends. And I wonder at that point how hard it's going to be to move past some of the things that were in President Putin's speech of yesterday, essentially, for example, denying the right of Ukraine to an independent nationhood, but also the demands made by the Foreign Ministry, which included rolling back NATO to where it was before May 1997. I just think, can there be business as usual again in the foreseeable future?
No, I think Putin has made sure that he is not interested in business as usual. And therefore, we should also stop thinking in terms of, oh, I want it to be like it was. It's changed, and we have to accept that. The sooner we accept that, the sooner we can adapt a strategy how to best deal with that. So at some point, the expectation, the hope, I suppose, at some point, the escalation would need to end if there's not outright war in Ukraine. And at that stage, we have to also, and I think also already today, we have to start thinking long-term. How do we deal now with a Putin who has a blatant disregard for international law, for common decency even, who does not acknowledge the right of countries for self-determination, who reads history books, twists history for his own usage, and tries to justify how his country or his military has the right to subjugate someone else. I mean, these are anachronistic ideas and actually extremely dangerous. They've led to terrible wars in the past. And here we have a leader who actually espouses these ideas and enshrines them as his own doctrine. So we all have to start thinking differently, and we need to stop thinking, oh, it's going to go back to business as usual. This is the new usual, so to speak. We have an aggressive neighbor who is interested in recreating an empire, who believes in the right to subjugate others and has a disregard for national self-determination. This is a threat to all of us, and we have to be tough and willing to counter this threat in the long term.
Christianis Karins, thank you very much.
The Latvian Prime Minister there. Now, one of the things that distinguishes this crisis is that Russia has many options, an array of military, political and diplomatic. The West's are narrower. While there are things they can do to support Ukraine militarily or instruments like cyber warfare, most of the discussions in Western countries concern inflicting economic pain on Russia. And no sooner were various measures announced today than a debate began about whether the sanctions dial should be turned even harder. Here's Ben Chu.
Western sanctions were threatened if Vladimir Putin moved on Ukraine. Now they're here.
we will make it as difficult as possible for the Kremlin to pursue its aggressive actions.
I'm going to begin to impose sanctions in response far beyond the steps we and our allies and partners implemented in 2014.
They will hit Russia very hard.
But how do these sanctions measure up to the rhetoric? The UK is sanctioning 5 Russian banks which it says are involved in financing the invasion, although these do not include Russia's biggest state banks. Also, 3 high net worth individuals with links to Putin, Gennady Timchenko, Boris Rottenberg and Igor Rottenberg, will see their UK assets frozen and barred from travel to the UK. Yet these individuals are already on the US sanctions list, and the UK government is not yet sanctioning all Kremlin-linked oligarchs with property and other assets in Britain. As for the EU, it today sanctioned members of the Russian parliament, Russian banks, and prohibited EU trade with the breakaway regions of Ukraine, whose streets were deserted today. Similarly, the US will prohibit new investment, trade and financing from or in those regions. The UK government has argued that
Do you feel that the UK should go harder earlier when it comes to sanctions?
Absolutely. I think what we've seen today was too light. It was essentially taking a pea shooter to a gunfight. That hasn't sent a strong message to the Kremlin. I think Vladimir Putin will perhaps be less concerned now about sanctions coming from the West than he might have been. The Prime Minister talked about this being the first tranche, and indeed retaining leverage makes some sense. But I think we have to put ourselves in the shoes of Vladimir Putin, and he is only going to respect strength.
Be that as it may, the most significant sanction on Russia announced today came from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who announced approval of the new $11 billion Nord Stream 2 pipeline, designed to bring natural gas direct from Russia to Germany, would be halted because of Putin's actions. A former Russian president explicitly suggested that this decision would increase gas prices across the continent. Welcome to the brave new world, where Europeans are very soon going to pay €2,000 for 1,000 cubic metres of natural gas. And indeed, the decision instantly sent up European natural gas price contracts by 10%. Remember, from levels that are already causing a cost of living crisis across the continent, including the UK.
We are going to feel the crisis in Ukraine and Russia, we are going to feel it on our pockets. Every time that we pay our utility bills, electricity or gas, or we go to the petrol station, we are going to feel those political maneuvers have consequences for us here.
In the long term, the Nord Stream 2 decision could help accelerate European decarbonisation efforts and enhance our energy and geopolitical security by weaning us off Russian gas quicker. But in the short term, let's be clear, this is the sanctions decision that has the most potential to rebound economically on the West.
The leverage that the Kremlin has right now is keeping natural gas supplies in Europe as tight as they can, so they keep prices elevated. The leverage that Europe has is cancelling Nord Stream 2. Both are using that leverage today to the maximum extent.
A necessary economic conflict, perhaps, from the West's perspective, if, like these protesters in Germany today, it wants to at least try to check Russian aggression towards Ukraine, but very far from a domestically painless one.
Well, to discuss now the sanctions and other possible policy measures that can be taken, we're joined by Sir David Lidington, former Cabinet Minister and now Chair of the Royal United Services Institute think tank. David Lidington, I don't know whether you heard one of your in-house experts there describing the UK sanctions as a pea shooter. Do you go along with that? Could the UK be doing more at this moment?
Well, I think we could be doing more. And I felt that, well, I understand the reasons why I think the British, like the American government and probably the EU tomorrow, are slightly pulling their punches in the hope that Putin will stop at the sort of already Russian-controlled areas in eastern Ukraine and not go further. My own view is that Putin is only likely to be deterred, if at all, by countermeasures and sanctions that are more stronger than he has expected. And I think a lot of what's been announced today, regrettably, will have been priced in. So I think we do need to go further. I hope the government is right in its judgment that it's worth just trying one more time to see if this conflict can be contained because of the human misery and loss of life that will be caused otherwise. But my own view is that we need to go further and the sooner we get on with that, the better. The government has taken enabling powers to sanction a wide range of sectors of Russian finance and business, the people and the companies involved with it. So they have the enabling powers. They can bring those sanctions forward at the drop of a hat.
The counter-argument, though, presumably, is if you go to full force straight away, then Vladimir Putin thinks, well, I might as well just crack on and achieve what I think I can achieve militarily, because I'm going to be under all these sanctions anyway.
Well, I think the imposition of sanctions, of course, can be made conditional upon Putin respecting Ukraine's internationally recognized frontiers, including recognized by Russia, of course, in more than one international treaty, basically getting his foot off Ukraine's neck. So I think we need to do more on sanctions. I also think that it is now time that our own government brought forward changes in the law to provide for greater transparency when it comes to Russian financial holdings and property assets in United Kingdom jurisdiction. And I'm not going to pretend that that is straightforward. I think it will need an act of Parliament to sort it out, and there'll be constitutional issues with the Crown dependencies and British overseas territories. But I think now that has to be done.
Lastly, Boris Johnson is clearly perceived in Kiev rather differently to in Westminster right now. Is this a chance for him to redefine his premiership, do you think?
Oh, it's certainly a chance for him to demonstrate leadership. And, I'm not exactly a paid-up member of the Prime Minister's fan club, particularly on European policy, but I do think on Ukraine, so far, he's handled things right. I was disappointed the sanctions didn't go further today, but the very strong stand he's taken in support of Ukrainian sovereignty and self-determination, it seems to be is absolutely the right one. And what we heard from Putin was denying Ukraine's right to exist. And I mean,
thank you.
That could have implications elsewhere in Europe. We really have got to be aware this is going to be a long haul.
Thank you very much to David Lidington. So what's driving the man at the heart of this crisis? And in the sweep of history, how big a moment is this for relations between Moscow and the West? Well, Vladimir Putin had been hardening his tone even before this crisis. That dawned on some last July when his speech on Ukraine essentially denied its right to be independent of Russia. Then there were the security demands, that's the term the Russians themselves used, for a raft of requests in December that asked for a rolling back of NATO in Eastern Europe. Even many Russian analysts felt that sounded like someone who'd won a war dictating the terms, not the loser of the Cold War. And then last night's speech, full of dark insinuations about the recent history of Russia, Ukraine and the West. So joining us live now in the studio to discuss that are Orysia Lutsevich, head of the Ukraine Forum within the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House. That's the think tank in London. And down the line from the US is Andrei Kozyrev, Boris Yeltsin's foreign minister from 1990 to 1996, and Charles Kupchan, Director of European Affairs on the US National Security Council under Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Welcome to you all. Orysia, when you look at this type of statement that's been coming from Vladimir Putin in recent days, do you think he's been fundamentally misunderstood by the West in terms of the depth of these resentments and the historical roots he draws on?
Well, you clearly hear when you listen to Putin an ideological speech. This is not a history neither of Ukraine or Russia. This is a testament to a possible future invasion into Ukraine for the Russian populations. And the problem with this is that what he attributes history as a function. He basically says if there was something that existed in the past, it's a predetermined fact that it will continue in the future. This is not what history history is about. Of course, you can see a sentiment of resurrection of Russia getting off its knees. Perhaps by annexing Crimea, Russia got off its knees, and now is trying to put West on its knees by compelling it to recognize Russia's sphere of coercion, entitlement.
Yeah, sphere of influence is a phrase that constantly comes up. Andrei Kozyrev, I mean, you heard that long historical speech, I mean, including these things like Lenin invented Ukraine. I mean, how much of it accords with your sense of the last 100 years? Because after all, you lived through the Soviet system as well.
Well, as it was correctly said, it's not a historic research, a historic speech even. It's just a propaganda addressed to Russian people and to what they call in America chumps or useful fools outside, and there are some. So it's all twisted, all distorted, and if Lenin is blamed for something, it was that he forced actually Ukraine and other so-called republics or other countries around Russia back into the Russian Empire, because they ran away at first. They had run away at first, and then he forced them inside, which was called a voluntary union. So it's even on that kind of...
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. Charles Kupchan, sorry, can I bring you in now? Look, obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union, Putin, of course, is famously quoted as saying it's the greatest disaster of the 20th century, is a key moment in this. Do you think to an extent the West misplayed the opportunities offered by the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Well, if you go back to the early 90s, and that really is when the current crisis began, a discussion took place about how to build a new European security order. And there were lots of different ideas around. One that ended up being grasped was the enlargement of NATO. And since the very beginning, going back to the Yeltsin years, the Russians have said, don't do this. Why are you bringing NATO's borders closer to us? We feel excluded. We can debate whether it was the right move or the wrong move, but in many respects, we're seeing this process come to a culmination in Ukraine, partly because it's Ukraine, partly because I think Putin feels emboldened. He's got big cash reserves. He's supported by China. He thinks that the West is weak. The one caveat that I would offer here is that Putin has generally taken small bites. Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Crimea, Donbass. To go into Ukraine proper, to try to invade and occupy the country, that's not a small bite.
No.
It is a huge undertaking.
Andrei Kozyrev.
And that leads me to get to question, is he really going to do that?
Andrei Kozyrev, can I just come back to you? Something Charles was saying early on there about that moment in the early 90s. Obviously, you were the foreign minister. Do you think President Clinton blew it in terms of perhaps having hubris about the victory of the West? Could he have made a more generous offer to Russia?
Yes, the Clinton administration made mistakes, but those were diplomatic mistakes. While politically, the problem was that in Russia, there were powerful people for whom the Cold War never ended. And some of them are already in Kremlin right today, and that's what you see. And the political problem is that this group considers NATO an enemy of Russia, as it was definitely an enemy of the Soviet Union, because they want to be, and they make Russia like the Soviet Union, the seized fortress and militaristic power and all that. And they keep the power on that propaganda and on this policy. It is not a just conviction, it's conviction of convenience to keep the power. So politically, it was a Russian problem, and it is a Russian problem that they cannot understand the reality of Europe when NATO is not an enemy, not as an aggressive pact. NATO is defending its, and that's why NATO now is mobilizing, because they feel threatened.
Oh dear,
All right,
that's
Andrei,
not
let me
good.
put that to Arisia from Ukraine, actually, here. Andrei's point, obviously, is about the enemy image of NATO in Russia, but I wonder whether mistakes were also made with regard to Ukraine, the offer in 2008, which we know from Chancellor Scholz standing there in the Kremlin last week, they have no intention of following through with the offer of NATO membership to Ukraine. Did they lie in that sense to the Ukrainians as well?
I think it's very important what Mr. Kozyrev said about the trajectory of Russia internally. And this, we should remember, is indeed the cause of this crisis, is autocratic kleptocracy, a leader that is trying to hold to power. So neither, of course, we could have calibrated policy in the West to see how we could financially support more Russia, how we could engage more Russia, but it's that U-turn that took place. And Ukraine, of course, under those circumstances, Putin's revisionist aggression is pushing Ukraine towards NATO, and whether or not it will be decided by a sovereign right of nations. This is the fundamental principle of international order, be it NATO, be it European Union, be it any other alliance, and no neighbor country can dictate on that.
I'm very sorry, we're almost out of time, and I want to bring in Charles Kupchan again to give you another go. I mean, look, let's talk about the legacy question here for Putin. As some people suggest, does he really see himself as another Peter the Great or someone to re-establish the greatness of Russia, or is that overstating it, do you think?
I feel the need to say I think it vastly overstates it. I think he's a pretty shrewd tactician, but a bad strategist, because ultimately this is going to backfire. You know, Putin is an autocrat. He is rowing against the tide of history. He has a country that continues to rely on energy revenues when fossil fuels are headed toward the trash heap. If he goes into Ukraine, he will not be remembered as a great Russian leader. He will be remembered as an aggressor. So right now he is on a dangerous path, pushing Russia in the wrong direction and taking Ukraine down a very destructive path if he does so. Let's hope he decides not to go into Ukraine.
Charles Kupchan, Andrei Kozyrev, Arisa, thank you all indeed very much. I'm sorry. That's all from us tonight. Katie Razzle will be here tomorrow. From all of us, goodbye.
Hello there. The next few days